Good morning. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about watersheds and hydrographs. During this video, I will answer the following questions. What makes a watershed? Where does a stream get its water? And how do natural and human factors affect how streams respond to storms? First, let's define a term. A drainage basin or watershed is a region where all of the water that falls on it eventually flows or drains to the same location or outlet. The edges of the drainage basin are the high elevation areas. The ridges that separate one drainage basin from another are called drainage divides, as shown by the red dotted line on the diagram above me. Within a drainage basin, there's an interconnected drainage network of streams and sometimes lakes and wetlands. Here's a note on terminology. Hydrologists are scientists who study water. And to us, the term stream can include everything from the smallest trickle that you can step right over to the largest rivers like the Mississippi and the Amazon. As long as it's flowing water in a channel with defined edges, it's a stream. When we want to talk about the small streams only, we often use the term headwaters or headwater streams. Of course, the English language overall is much richer than the scientific terminology, so you may also think of these as creeks, cricks, runs, brooks, all sorts of different names depending on where you're from. So watersheds contain our streams and rivers, and each watershed flows to one place. We can define watersheds at all sorts of different scales, from the continental to the very local. At the continental scale, the high areas that divide watersheds are often mountain ranges. In the US, the Rocky Mountains divide water that flows towards the Pacific Ocean, like the Colorado River outlined in blue on the top map, from water that flows towards the Gulf of Mexico, like the Mississippi River Basin, outlined in yellow on the map. The Appalachian Mountains also form another important drainage divide, separating waters flowing towards the Gulf from waters that flow directly to the Atlantic Ocean. Ohio is divided into two main watersheds. Most of the streams in the state ultimately flow toward the Ohio River, which then flows into the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. But the northern portion of the state is in the Lake Erie watershed. Lake Erie is part of the Great Lakes, and they drain into the St. Lawrence River and ultimately the Atlantic Ocean in New Brunswick, north of Maine. But we can zoom in further in Ohio and see that the Lake Erie and Ohio River watersheds are made up of smaller watersheds, including the Muskingum and Scioto, which drain to the Ohio River, and the Cuyahoga and Maumee draining into Lake Erie. Kent State University's Kent campus is located in the Cuyahoga River watershed, so let's zoom in even farther there. This map shows all of the watersheds within the Cuyahoga River watershed. The Kent State University campus is located within the Breakneck Creek watershed, number 20, near the bottom of this map, right next to my head. The Breakneck Creek watershed lies within the Cuyahoga River watershed, which again is within the Lake Erie watershed. And finally, that's within the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River watershed that drains the Atlantic Ocean. Hopefully, from looking at all four of these maps, you can see that streams and rivers of all sizes are nested within watersheds of all sizes. And it's not just a matter of naming things. The land within the watershed affects the way water moves to the streams and rivers, and therefore how much water they have in both wet and dry periods. Let's turn to that next. When it rains, most rain doesn't fall directly on a stream. Instead, it falls onto the land and has to make its way to the stream, over or through the land itself. Of course, some rain doesn't ultimately make it to the stream and instead gets used by plants in the process of transpiration, or it evaporates from the land surface. Both evaporation and transpiration return water directly to the atmosphere. But for now, let's follow rain that does make it to the stream. Most of it moves into the ground in a process called infiltration. Some of that infiltrated water moves down to the water table and then flows as groundwater toward the stream. Because groundwater flow has to work its way through tiny openings or pores in the soil, sediment, or rock, it moves very, very slowly. Because of groundwater's slow movement, it's still making its way towards the streams even when it's sunny out. Groundwater flowing into streams is the reason that streams in this part of the country don't dry up between rainstorms. We call the water in the streams between storms base flow. Sometimes it rains hard enough that the soil can't soak up all of the rainfall, or it rains so often that the soil is already full of water. In this case, we say the ground is saturated. When either of these things happen, some water moves towards the streams as overland flow. Overland flow can move much more quickly than groundwater, and so it supplies the stream with water only during storms and for short periods after them. Overland flow is one of the reasons that streams rise or even flood after heavy rainfall. We can measure the flow in streams over time to understand how they respond to rainfall and snowmelt. When we make a graph of the data, we call it a hydrograph, literally graph of water. Here we can represent the precipitation, rain or snowmelt, as bars and flow in the streams as a line on the graph. The horizontal x-axis is time. In this graph, we can see that at the very beginning, the stream has little discharge and that the water is base flow from groundwater only. Then it rains, and sometime later, the stream discharge rises with contributions from both groundwater and overland flow. The time difference between the precipitation and the peak discharge is the lag time. After the peak discharge, the flow in the stream starts to drop, and eventually this stream is sustained only by base flow groundwater again. The next time it rains, the sequence starts all over. What affects the shape of the hydrograph response to precipitation? The watershed does, because the landscape, including the soils, topography, and vegetation, influences the total amount of water that reaches the stream, how quickly it gets there, and how high the peak discharge is. These graphs show some examples. Imagine two watersheds where everything is the same except size, as shown in the top left corner. In the small watershed, there's a small amount of water and it reaches the stream outlet quickly. In the large watershed, there's more water and it reaches the stream outlet more slowly. Can you work out why vegetation, steepness, and soil type have the effects that they do? Trees and grasses use some water for transpiration and they slow down overland flow. They also help keep soil loose so that more water can infiltrate and become groundwater, sustaining base flow. On the lower right, steep slopes drain both overland flow and groundwater more quickly than gentle slopes, resulting in a shorter lag time, higher peak flow, and lower base flow. And on the lower left, impermeable soils that don't allow much infiltration promote greater overland flow and less groundwater flow, and that changes the hydrograph as shown. Humans can also change the hydrograph. Cities seal the soils with impermeable surfaces like pavements and rooftops. That increases overland flow or stormwater runoff. We then add pipes, gutters and storm sewers, to bring the water to streams more quickly. As a result, urban streams tend to have much higher peak flows and shorter lag times than streams in nearby forested watersheds, as shown in the example. Much of my research focuses on how urbanization affects these stream responses and the ways that we can try to help urban streams have hydrographs more like they did when they were forested watersheds. The first part of your online activity this week will have you thinking through how these natural and human factors affect hydrographs. In the next lecture, we'll talk about large hydrograph responses, i.e. floods.